Okay, good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1428. Just to sum up what we've been learning. So he's discussing that verse in Jeremiah, in Yirmiyahu, talking about the Malachim, that Hamu Me'ai loy rachim arachmenu, that this child, which is Yaakov the Ephraim, my precious child, so my innards, which is referring to the angels, feel for him, compassion. And he's explaining because compassion, as we said, is a divine energy that originates in Atzilus, and even higher than Atzilus. As we've learned, and I'll explain in a moment. They channel it and they process it, the angels, that is, may I. What we said, the gut, the word, the innards, the gut, the intestines, the kishkis, as we put it. They channel it, and that's why the word may I is used here, as in the stomach, as the gut. So to explain this, the Rebbe Rashab began with a question. To understand what this compassion is, how can we associate compassion to above? Compassion seems to be a human attribute, that we're affected by events around us. When someone's in need of compassion, our hearts melt, like he put it. It comes from a certain chlishus. Doesn't mean weakness. It means certain sensitivity. Someone who's completely unchangeable, and Ashni Hashem Leishanisi should not be subject to compassion or to any emotions for that matter. So how do we speak about Rachamim and Chesed and Gvura, which is all emotional interactions where we're affected by those around us? So we have either attracted to them or love, or Gvura as in strength, overpowering, like he said, Mizgaber, or Rachamim, Misrachim. How can that be applied above? The Chachmei Mechkar say, the thinkers, he brings the Rambam and the Kuzri, Moreh Nevuchim and the Kuzri, they say that you can't say attributes above. It's just saying that when God is engaging and dealing with the human race, where there are attributes, so that's when we use the word Rachamim an Hashem. To use the expression that he said, Lo yesh inyan amidus l'mayla. But rather, when Keshu Yisbarach Mesaken Dover Shebemidus Bnei Adam, when he's involved, engaged, intervening in human activities, so the Harachmim Miyachsim Alabei the Harachmim Avaloshi Inyan Rachmim Mamish L'mayla. So it's not like the divine personality. He gives the example of a shefet, of a judge. So a judge is engaged in ruling and listening to evidence, whether someone's guilty or not guilty. And when he rules, it's not that he has the emotion that he feels kindness to someone. In other words, he's not guilty, so it's his chesed. Or gvura, that he's guilty. The judge is impartial, he's detached. But he's ruling on something that has been brought before him, so he's more like the objective arbiter. So according to this, it's not that God himself has kindness or gvura, strength or compassion. It's only hashpah of his. When he's actually giving kindness, so he's giving kindness, you call him chesed. So when you say the word chesed on the Eibishter, you don't mean he has that attribute. It means he's now acting in a chesedic way. A judge is not that he is kind to the person, he's acting in a kind way by acquitting him, not guilty. And the same thing with Rachamim. He's called Rachum when the behavior is in a compassionate fashion. So it's not that they say that God is not being compassionate. It's just that compassion can't be associated with the divine itself. He says, Avla emes eina emes came. But the truth, it's not that way. Because we know there's 10 spheres. And the 10 spheres are not human spheres. They're not our faculties. They're divine spheres. God emanated 10 attributes that came from him. So you can't say it's just interacting with us, with existence. It's also divine. He said the words, Hamides Lamaila, Ayin Beis, that's the 10 higher spheres, and Zayin Tachtein is the 7 lower of the 10, is Chesed, Gvura, Rachimim, etc. Which means that he himself is compassionate. He himself is Chesed, has Chesed. He himself has Gvura. And when we say Chanun v'Racham Hashem, Zuchei Rachamecha v'Chasedecha, your Rachamim, your Chesed, not just your Hashpah of Chesed, but you yourself, it associates, these attributes associate with the divine. So Acha Inyan, so how do we explain it? When we said before that God, you see, is not affected, she says, because here we're not talking about attributes as they're affected. They're not as a result of his spilus, because of Azulas. By human beings, you see someone, let's say, homeless, and you feel compassion for the person. Or you see someone that deserves chesed, you give them kindness. It's impacted by each other and by phenomenon around us. By the divine, it starts the other way around. Within the divine, there's what he calls atzmim. It's mitzad etzem. Loishem ispalim min azulas, hainu min anavraim, but it's be'etzem. Mitzad etzem. Being that God is teiv be'etzem, so therefore, from that extends mistayif, or branches out, an attribute called kindness. In other words, who created kindness? It's not a human creation, it's a divine creation. So in other words, God is beyond it all, but he also has that capacity. Same thing, his power to limit, to restrain, is the Kayach Hagbala name. Just as the power to create infinite, he has the power to create the finite. So it's the power of God. And mistayef mizeh, what branches off and what extends from that? Midas HaGvura. In their highest root. And that's what the Vedas HaKadosh says, that as he has the power of Bligvul, he has the power of Gvul. What is it in the highest root? The power to shine, Yecholte Eloheh, that he has the capacity to express, to reveal, and Yecholte Shaloy, and the capacity not to reveal. This has nothing to do with Shanisi. This is not a change in God affected by anything. It's he from within his own etzem is choosing to express different capacities that he has. That's in its root. And Rachamim, there's also Rachamim Ma'atzmim, meaning God is also the core capacity of compassion. Keil Mole Rachamim, a God that is filled with compassion. That means that's his etzem. He has compassion within him, meaning not that he's defined by it, but that he has the capacity. That means the radiant face of the living king. From that will branch, from that will evolve, or I'll say the evolve is maybe not the right word, will extend, will branch off the midah of Rachamim. So what he's introduced now that the Chachmei HaMechkar have not discussed is not that just God, that bides, that these attributes are human attributes, and God, when he engages with us, is acting in that way, but that the divine itself has these attributes. So I want to elaborate on this before we continue on, because this is, as I said yesterday, one of the most important and fundamental themes in Chassidus that really explains the interface in the most eloquent way of all. Because as I've pointed out many times, the big question that remains, which is really a Torah question, a question that addressing all Jewish thinkers, whether it was the philosophers, whether it was the Balei Nigla, the Talmudists, and whether it was the mystics, are all challenged with this issue of God's relationship with us. Because on one hand, we fully understand that God and the creation have nothing in common. Because he's a creator, we're the creation. We're not creation, we're not, it's as antithetical as it gets. Yes, the creation is God's creation, but still, we're finite, we're limited, we're mortals, we have strengths and weaknesses. Our lives are subject to all kinds of rules. We're not all powerful, we're not omnipresent, we're not what's the word? When you say omniscience? Yeah. We're
omniscient,
omnipotent. We all have our limits. So in every possible way, there's nothing in common with us and God. And yet God created the universe for a purpose. So on a very basic level, if you didn't think about it, you could just say very simple. God is a completely different reality. He created us, and he wants us to follow his guidelines. Basically, like we're servants who have nothing in common with our master, and we're supposed to do mitzvahs. God wants us to do it. And when we do it, we get rewarded. We have Olam Haba. But is there a relationship between the two? Does a servant have a relationship with his master? He doesn't have to understand him. He doesn't have to love him even. He just has to follow orders. However, everybody knows, I'm talking about all the thinkers, that it's a little more complicated than that. First of all, we have verses in the Torah. I'm going to speak both from texts, from scripture, and from logic. We have texts that clearly indicate a relationship that's deeper than just a creator and a creation, a master and a servant. First of all, the human being was created in the divine image. That right away throws it all for a loop. We're suddenly not just creations. We're not just like the sun and the moon and vegetation and light and animals and fish and birds created in the first 5-6 days. Suddenly something unique. Selam Elokim. What is that? That means that we have something divine within us. Not just that we're divine creatures. Everything has divine energy within it, but some type of divine personality. The Rambam, for example, when it says, Hein haya adam achad mimenu, that man will be like one of us, what God is saying, that's bal bchira, that the human being has free will. No other creature has free will. Free will is somewhat divine, because how do we have free will? Why are we not just like every other creation that just goes by clockwork and just follows the program which we were programmed? We're able to deviate from the program, either for good or for bad. So that right away tells you there's more to the human than just this puppet that's following orders and just lives up to. Besides for the question, why would God create a creation that's just living up to his program? What does he need a bunch of robots and puppets to just do what? So clearly there's more to the picture. Then we have verses like V'yadaita hayim, v'shavesa levavecha ke'avayu alekim b'shamayim mimal v'aretz mitachas eined. You should know God, not just believe in him. To know, das alekei avicha, know your father, God your father. Then we have references like a father. He's not just a master, a father and a child. Matan Torah is compared to a marriage, God marrying the people. So all this and many, many more texts and scriptures indicate a relationship that's far more complicated, far more intimate than just creator and creation. It's not just an author and a book, or an artist and a piece of art. This piece of art, meaning the human being, namely, should have a relationship with God, to know God. Then we have v'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, love God. I mean, now, how do we love something that's completely of a different reality? There's nothing in common. You could say love another human being. We have something in common. But here, so all this compels all the Torah scholars and all the thinkers, what exactly is this relationship? How do we reconcile the two? The God that's completely beyond us, and now we're created, and we have some relationship with it. How do you have a relationship that's not just based on action? Again, no problem. Master, servant, bring me food, bring me a carbon, put on tzitzis, tefillin, light candles, Shabbos. But here we're saying there's a relationship. We understand God, we know God, we love God. And then, of course, expressions the other way around, that God loves us. As I said, the expression of child and parent, partners. Shutaf la'Kodesh Baruch Hu b'ma'aseh b'reishis. I don't want to go every text and source. There's so many. Even what we mentioned the other day, that we even have the power to affect the divine. That we can weaken godliness and we can strengthen godliness. So all this creates a tremendous philosophical and theological quandary. How can you interface and find something in common by two things that have nothing in common. So the Chachmei HaMechkar, the way he put it, the philosophers, their approach is mostly that God is beyond, but Dibra Torah B'Loshen B'nei Adam, God, because he created existence, so in some way, metaphorically, he allows himself to be engaged with this existence. So you can't say God has eyes, or God gets angry, or God has compassion. It's just a language for us. When God interacts with us in a compassionate way, we're saying God has compassion. But the divine is removed, for all practical purposes. Not removed, God forbid, from creating existence or sustaining existence, but removed from us really having a full understanding of the divine. That's one way it's explained. There are other philosophers, like, for example, the Rambam says, Hu hamada hu yidei hu yidua, that he agrees God is beyond, but God also is someone that is engaging with these attributes, and instead we know things as they're outside of us. I know you because you exist, so my mind understands you. But God knows things from within. He is the Mada, he's the knower, he's the knowledge, and he's the thing that is known. That's a famous expression from the Rambam, when he explains how God's knowledge is different than ours. We know things outside, but God knows them because he encompasses everything within him. Comes the Maral of Prague, and he says, how could you say that? God is beyond das. His thoughts are not, my thoughts are not your thoughts. How could you define God as being one with das? And he disagrees with the Rambam. Comes Chassidus and explains, and here's where the Tanya, in Tanya, at least in four places, Alter Rebbe brings it. First place is in the gloss, in the Haggadah in chapter 2. Then later in chapter 28, I think, or 29, 49 rather, 48, 49. And then the Shayach V'Amuna, and says, and reconciles. The Maral is talking about the divine that's beyond knowledge. We all acknowledge there's a level like that. The Rambam is talking about the divine as he manifests in knowledge. And then the Alter Rebbe adds that according to the Kabbalah of Ramak, Ramoshe Karavira, and the Chen Yetziva Milson, the same with Arizal, in the Sefiros of Atzilus, the Rambam is correct, because Atzilus has das, Chachma Bina das, Chesed Gvura Tiferes Netzach Hei said Malchus, and Hu Amada Hu Yedeya. Those attributes are one with the one that has the attributes, which is God. So in other words, the Rambam is talking about how things are in Ishtalshlus, in Atzilus. The Maral is referring to that which is beyond. So it's not a contradiction. But what really lies behind this discussion? So it also touches upon something that you may recall. The disagreements in the Kabbalists have different shittas about the Sefiros. These 10 spheres that we're talking about, what are they exactly? Because on one hand, God is not defined by anything. On the other hand, we're saying these are his Sefiros. In the Sefer Yetzirah, it says he emanated as a Sefiros, Blima. So there are actually three opinions. One opinion in the Sefiros are just instruments. God created a hammer, screwdriver. They're instruments. They're not divine in the sense that the divine has attributes. They're only the kelim. The Sefiros are the kelim. But the Eiros are Eiros pshutim. The Eiros are shapeless and seamless. So think of the Eiros as being like your hand, and the kelim is the hammer you use. So the hammer is so to speak, it's created by God, but you don't attribute that feature, chesed, it is attributed to the instrument, not to the creator. That's one opinion. Another opinion, no, the Eiros themselves, the energy itself is also Eiros Mitziyarim. They also have, subtly at least, an attribute. It's Eir HaChesed, in Klei HaChesed. It's not just shapeless light in a colored or tinted glass, meaning the Keli is the tziyur, is the structure, and the Eir is shapeless, but the Oyer itself also has an element of this attribute. And then the third opinion is ultimately the Ramak and the Arizal, they reconcile that the Oyer on its own is somewhat shapeless, but when it goes into the Keli, it takes on shape. And there are different ways to explain that as well, which I'm not going to go into. Chassidus comes and reconciles all of them. Says they're all true. Because in the interface, we need to know everything. We want to know on one hand that God has the power, like we just read here, just he has the power to create the infinite, he has the power to create the finite. So it's not that God is finite, God forbid. He has the capacity to emanate chesed. Why not? In other words, the philosophers who said that God is beyond chesed were in a way limiting God. Yes, he's not defined by chesed, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have the capacity to emanate chesed, as he's explaining here. On the other hand, we want to also remember that the divine is not defined by it. So that's why each opinion is focusing on a different dimension. If you want to focus on the divine interaction with us, so the Sefiros of Atzilus is the divine as he's manifesting in these attributes that we can relate to. So we say, Mahu Chanun, Afata Chanun. Just as God is Rachum, compassionate, so too you should be compassionate. We have a meeting place now. There's an interface that the divine, which is really beyond everything, chose to express himself through compassion, not because he needs to, not because he's spileless, not because there's a change in him, but because he chose to manifest there. And when he chooses to manifest, he is interacting in a real way. And that's where we meet him. But we also know, as we've been learning all the time here, that when you go back and trace the steps, you'll trace the steps from the compassion of God, that the compassion of God in its source is only the capacity to have compassion. Remember, Shem, Shmois, Shemesh, it's only like a name. And beyond that is the Shmei HaGadol, that's not even broken into any details. And beyond that is pure the Etzem, Shmei HaAtzmi, that's not even that. In other words, the very fact that God has compassion ultimately is going to lead you to a place that God is beyond compassion, and that beyond manifests in the compassion, and that compassion relates to our compassion. So essentially, we have here now stepping stones that can take us from a completely finite, defined structure in existence to lead us to the divine structure, which in turn leads us to the divine that's beyond structure, to the divine, which is Sevav Kalaman, all the way to the Etzem, which is completely beyond structure altogether, as we've learned. So all this, what we learned, Hamayrik Be'echad, is exactly the process. You begin with a structured existence. You first define and find and discover this existence is not self-made, but it's created by God. And God has manifested himself, the divine energy, tailored to each part of existence, which is very much part of what the angels do. They help the processing to channel it. But then as you work your way back, you realize it's coming from a place that's not so defined. Remember, Dibur, Machshava, thought, then the faculties, and then all the way to the superconscious, and all the way up to before the Tzimtzum. So as you work your way up in the contemplation, you come to realize that that which we began with structure, that led us to the divine structure, actually is going back to a place that's beyond structure. And all of that, all the way to the highest, is the same unity from God's perspective as it is within existence. But it takes us many, many steps and many years of serious contemplation and Aveda to come to this type of perception and awareness. But in truth, ultimately, you end up having a seamless union between the highest states of God's unity that are completely beyond, and with existence, by understanding that God has both the capacity to be completely beyond, but also the capacity to create a structure that reflects his so-called attributes, even though he's beyond the attributes. Like we learned that God manifested in it, but he's not defined by it. Like what he said before, it's not leiza ikar elakus. This is not the primary thing of God to be giving off light or creating, but it is part of his power, capacity to do so. So basically, Chassidus ultimately is teaching us that we can have both worlds, that the relationship between us and God is far more far more intimate and deeper than just a creator and a creation, a master and a slave, a master and a servant, because we are created in the divine image, and we have the capacity through our own efforts to slowly climb this ladder, the stepping stones, and come to understand the deepest levels of divine unity and understand them within the structures from which we exist. But we have to come to understand that the structures, ultimately, from God's perspective, are just God wanting a structure, not because God is defined by the structure. We are defined by the structure, but we can come to relate our defined structure to God's so-called undefined structure, meaning how the indeterminism has chosen to become deterministic, not because he has to be, but because he wants to be, and because he has the capacity to be. So ultimately, that's why he's explaining here how the midah of rachamim is not just a human attribute, it's a divine attribute. And at the same time, it's an atzmi. It's not because God is subject to emotions as we are, it's because he created emotions and he wants emotions. And indeed, it's the exact opposite. The emotions that we have originate in God's emotions, so to speak, God's attributes, not the other way around. And that's how everything is turned over. As a matter of fact, in some places it says, the Rebbe Marash, whose birthday was the other day, said that, I think the Rebbe Marash, one of the Rabbeim said, Kabbalah teaches how the divine, the infinite divine, manifests in the structure of the human. Chassidus teaches how the structure of the human is truly divine. Interesting take on it, which is what the Rebbe Marash actually said, that people think Chassidus is an explanation of Kabbalah. But the truth is, Kabbalah is an explanation of Chassidus, because Kabbalah is talking about how the divine manifests in structure, and Chassidus teaches us how the structure leads us to the divine that's beyond structure. So ultimately, as we have talked a number of times, Chachma, wisdom, is not just wisdom. Wisdom is God's creation that allows the human being to imagine and to travel to places that are beyond our subjective reality. It's about experiencing a higher truth. So in a sense, when you look at the spheres from God's eyes, they're basically 10 different ways of divine expression. Chesed is divine revelation. Gvura is divine concealment or divine restraint. Rachamim is God's power of compassion. We see them as emotions that are defined. But from the divine, the divine root of them all, like he just explained, are God's capacities, just 10 different ways of expressing one divine. And so it's really all one with 10 different expressions. And that becomes the root of the 10 spheres of Atzilus, which in turn is the root of the 10 faculties in the human being. So that's a brief synopsis of a lot. There's actually in Sefer Erchim, Encyclopedia of Chassidus, a whole erech called Eres Mitziyarim that's maybe 100 pages, maybe with elaborate footnotes that go through every one of the opinions and all the different aspects of it. So what I did here was distill it somewhat to be able to understand this piece here. That's just a summary of what we learned and also what we're going to learn right now. So now we'll read inside and you'll see how it all comes to life.
You spoke about Atmos, right?
I don't know. What do you mean? What do you explain? Whenever you say the word Atzmos, I always ask the same question. Tell me what you mean by Atzmos.
I mean Atmos that could not be defined in any way that is above any other thing, maybe even above Helem Atzmi. He himself.
Yeah, fine. Okay. But he has the capacity to create a finite existence as well. He's not defined by it, but he has the capacity to create definition. And he actually did. He created a world that's defined. That's the point here. So he's not defined by it, but he has the power to create. He's also not limited by it. In other words, it's like the Avedis HaKodesh said, just he has the power to create Bli Gvul, he has the power to create Gvul. Yeah, and when we understand Chassidus, and you go step by step, if you work your way from the bottom up, you work from structure, definition, to the source of definitions, to the Sefiros Hagnuzis, Oliver Itzene, where the artist desired and is envisioning the art And then you go to the artist that's beyond envisioning the art. Then you go to Shmei HaKol Ba'atzmusei, and that, but he's still a form of expression. Then you come to a point that's beyond expression, it's in the etzem, and then higher, that's in Hela Ma'atzmi, and then you go to a place that's beyond that. So all these steps is what God gave us, the stepping stones to extrapolate and to move from our understanding of something all the way to a point of beyond. The only way you ever get there is through this avodah of understanding step by step. And then you can come to truly appreciate the highest levels and then how those highest levels manifest in the lower level. So to understand the difference between Oyer and Keli is one thing. To understand the difference between Yecholte Lahoyer and Yecholte Shaloi Lahoyer is a completely different thing. So the difference between Oyer and Keli is an actual Oyer, an actual container, actual Chesed, actual Gvura. But what's the root of it? The power to give off Oyer, the power to reveal. Keli is the power to conceal. Both are powers in Yechelis Ha'atzmus. Now you're talking about on a far higher level. So it's really all about each of us figuring out where we relate to, and then slowly going higher as we go to higher states of this awareness. That's Hamayrich Be'echad. That's why you need Mayrich. You need to elaborate and extend and the contemplation on Echad, as we learned.
Is it because, could I just ask, is it because we experience emotions, so maybe it's hard to understand how you can express an emotion without experiencing it. In other words, I guess the difficulty for me is God's expression of Chesed. He doesn't feel it the way we feel. I mean, is that totally off base?
If we want to understand God and not just ourselves, we have to come to a point. Let me put it this way. A little child feels emotions and can have a tantrum or could be very kind, right? That's emotions. You look at a mature adult, they also could have anger, gvura, and chesed, kindness. But there's a big difference, right? This is childish emotions, so this is adult emotions. So as we mature in our understanding of our faculties, we can come to understand, let's take two mature adults, two people. They experience the same thing, and one person gets insulted, the other does not. Why? Because he has a moichen de gadlus. He's a far more mature person. He's not affected by pettiness. So what you see here in emotions itself, and we're not even talking about God right now, talking about in humans, higher and more mature emotional expressions. Most people are emotional creatures, and they become very impulsive and will react by whims. A person who's a thought-through person, who's much more developed and refined, their emotions are far more refined. We learned earlier in this volume that emotions grow to become that the mind actually trains the emotions to be far more objective than they are on their own, because they're subjective. So as you climb this ladder of understanding, then you can come to understand, okay, where do these emotions originate from? If they come from Atzilus, and Atzilus, they're completely divine emotions, which means the love of God, or the God love to us. It's not about being subject to a particular subjective experience that causes you to have love. So what you're doing is you're growing and understanding how emotions can go back to their root, that they can exist, but they're not existing so much based on subjective whims. And the deeper you go, the more you can understand emotions on that level. And yes, if you want to understand God's chesed, you ultimately have to come to a place that God is kind because he's kind, not because because he is subject to seeing something that needs kindness like we are. Is because it's the power of God to express himself. Ultimately, all of the attributes become divine expressions.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're showing kindness to someone in a very human way, you're actually revealing the attribute of God's kindness that he emanated from the source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I had something else.
Go ahead.
I
Anybody
just
else?
wanted to know the source. You mentioned there was a whole book that talked about the different perspectives.
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest anyone reading it without some help. It's very, very complex, but you can go ahead. Sefer Erchim Chabad. You ever hear of this book?
No.
Sefer Erchim Chabad is, right now we have only 7 volumes. It was compiled by, the editor was Rabbi Yoel Kahn. It's an encyclopedia of Chassidus. And there's an erech called Eris Mitziyarim. There's different entries. It starts with Aleph, and there's a whole entry that's it's literally hundreds of pages, and with many copious footnotes that discuss all the different opinions. Go for it. It's as I said, it can take months to study, just for the record, but it's there.
Is it online?
Many places. You need a teacher usually to understand. Excuse me.
Is it available?
Probably on Hebrew books.
Okay. That might be something worth after we finish Ayin Beis. Is that something you might want to teach?
No.
It's not interesting.
Too dense. I would teach it like I'm teaching it here through the Maimorim. To learn it there would be too. I think after a few classes, I think we would. It's too overwhelming.
Okay, I'll check it out. Just out of curiosity. Thank you. Please continue.
It's very thorough. It goes through every opinion, and you got it's like reading mathematical formulas.
Rabbi Jacobson, in our daily prayers, we always read Gomel Chasadim Tovim. What does that mean, Chasadim Tovim? That means that we're basically asking God for chesed, our terms. That itself is a proof that God's kindness is different than that the way we perceive it, because we're asking God to show us kindness from our perspective, but kindness of God is not necessarily what we think is kind. It's just the attribute of kindness, just like you said yourself.
Okay. There are many proofs here. Now, the next piece, I think we'll stop here, even though I know I started late, but the next piece is going to explain that there is also hispilus in Atzilus. So you asked before the question, in Etzem, in the highest levels, we know it's only God's attributes, meaning God's powers, his capacities. Like we said before about the names, they're names. God allowing himself to be called by a name, meaning allowing himself to be expressed through a particular attribute, which ultimately will evolve into an actual sphera after the tzimtzum and after many tzimtzumim. But being that the interface is complete, the question is, can we ever say that God does get affected by us? Like we said, his spilus, like we get affected by each other, which is essentially what human emotions are about, subjective reactions to each other or to events around us. You see something, it affects you. Can you say that the word impact and effect applies to God at all? Not in the highest levels. We know in the highest levels not. So he's going to explain that in Atzilus, where the Eris and Kalim come together, there is something we call hispilus. And that's why we say in the Torah, we say God feels our pain, that God, in some sense, feels compassion when he sees someone in need. So we still need to explain what those terms mean. We understand it's metaphorical and so on, but we're not just saying that God has attributes and is completely detached. We do know that God is not detached and he does care. We say God cares about us and God responds to our prayers and he feels for us. The question is, what does that mean? So in the Chachmei HaMechkar, the whole thing is metaphorical in the sense that we're not talking about God himself. But here we're talking that there are actually Sefiros, that God has manifest through 10 attributes. Or another way of phrasing the question, what is the difference in the Sefiros in Atzilus and the Sefiros, the hidden spheres before the Tzimtzum? They're both called spheres, And yet we said they're not the same. Spheres, for the Tzimtzum we learned before, are not actually spheres. He actually said they're only like names. They're God's capacities, as we've learned. In Atzilus, you don't say it's God's capacities, you say it's actual spheres. So what does that mean? On one hand, it's not Bri Yitzir Asiya, like by the human faculties. On the other hand, it's faculties and attributes that actually have definition. So the next piece is going to talk about hispilus in those midas of Atzilus and what that hispilus means, which of course still can't be a contradiction to Ani Hashem Leishanisi. So that's going to be the next piece in this whole so-called puzzle. But I think I mean this. We didn't learn inside anything new today, but I wanted the whole discussion. I think is vital to understand everything we are learning here. I want to see about the names where you said. Yeah, on page 1420, he said Shemus Levad, and I think he said actually that the spheres are not actual spheres. Trying to find the exact language. Yeah. Sinus Mokim. I'll just say one more thing I will say. We look at the world around us and we see trees, birds, we see a multitude of creation. So it's one thing saying Hashem Echad, that all of it are all parts, components of one divine creation, like pieces of like different parts of a jigsaw puzzle, or different parts of a piece of art. It's not just a sky or a bird or a horizon. It's all part of one bigger piece of art. It's another thing to say that when you look through God's eyes, it's actually not physical, it's not actual, real, distinctive entities. It's just God's capacity to create entities. In other words, he chose to manifest through these different elements. And then you're looking at it from God's eyes, so you don't really see, I mean, you see the distinctions, but it's not about their parameters that matter. It's about how they are all forms of expression of one entity, of one unity. That's like a bit the difference between Yehuda Tata and Yehuda Ilah. Yehuda Tata means you look at the existence and its details, and you connect them all to one source, or one picture, if you wish. Another is that you're looking at the unity first, and the unity has chosen to manifest in this way, in that way. Like I've spoken a number of times about mitzvahs, when we say Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvahs v'tzivanu ala chilas matzah. So Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvahs v'tzivanu, the focus is that God sanctified us with the mitzvahs. It's all God, and it happens to be there are different mitzvahs. When you speak about alachilas matzah, then the focus is on the matzah itself. So it's really a question of whether you're focusing on the klal or on the prat, on the big picture, or on the specifics as they feed the big picture. Just wanted to add that. We're going to stop here. I realize I have to stop here. Do that stop here. So this review